Our first speaker today is Kelly Close. She is the Client Technology Officer for LRE Water. She started out in 1992 working for a small engineering firm, and she discovered a passion for modern computer tech and data analysis. So I know that she created the Water Information Technology team, which I've heard her speak about before, and so I'm excited to hear what she has to tell us today. Would you help me in inviting Kelly to speak?
Perfect, thank you. Thanks, everybody. I guess I'll stand near the mic here. I'm with LRE Water. My name's Kelly Close. I work out of our Denver office. We have an office in Round Rock, also just north of Austin, and I work pretty closely with the folks there and a few groundwater districts here in Texas. And I wanted to talk with you today about something a little different. Normally, I come in just kind of doing a dog and pony show on some of the cool tools that we build and click around on them. It isn't that neat, but I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit today about kind of the drivers for why we create those tools in the first place. And in particular, some buzzwords that have become pretty commonly used as of late: predictive management, adaptive management. These are strategies for managing groundwater, managing a lot of resources, but in particular, are relevant to this conference, groundwater management strategies. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what they mean and what they mean individually, but more importantly, what they mean when you kind of combine them. That's, spoiler alert, that's where the real power is. And then how we can use some data-driven tools to support these kinds of strategies. I'll show you some examples of those things. I am told this might have a laser pointer. I'm not going to risk it. The little right hand button, is that going to advance me? Arrow. Yes. It's always sad when you hit the one that just ends the presentation right at the beginning. So just some basic definitions right now. Predictive management, adaptive management, they're kind of self-defining. But just at the risk of kind of being too basic here, I want to point out this very key difference. They're not interchangeable terms, is kind of my point. Predictive management is talking about anticipating future conditions, using modeling and analytics, historical and current data to really kind of predict what's going to happen, and then craft, decision-making policies around those predictions. Whereas adaptive management is about being flexible and iterative in your management policy structure and, taking actions based on those, maybe those models that you predicted with, but then looking at the impacts, looking at the outcomes of those actions, and then adapting and making changes in your approach if it's appropriate. And so it's focused on learning from experience, continual improvement. So putting these two concepts side by side, just one more definitions slide, this idea of predictive management and adaptive management. Predictive can actually kind of come in two flavors. There's this long-term, I think it's probably where your mind would go first of all when you're talking about predictive management tools, long-range planning tools, models, projects where you spend a lot of time gathering data from all the sources so that you can, really scrubbing it and making sure it's good so that your models have good inputs, thorough quality control, and then creating a really nice library of results from that. But that's very labor intensive. You're not going to do that continuously or very often. And then there's also this other side of predictive strategies, which are completely opposite, where you're looking at near real-time or real-time data, as close as real-time as you can get, to make predictive modeling results for emergency response or alerts related to, say, flooding or water quality response, things like that. So those are two kind of flavors of predictive management. And adaptive management is, I wouldn't say it's in the middle, because it's probably also taking long and short-term things into account, but it's really more about the process, the adaptive management process. And they require very different kinds of data to support and different kinds of tools. And you can certainly blend them together, but when you're talking about predictive management strategies, like I said, you're looking at big amounts of data and you're really scrubbing it carefully, or you're looking at telemetry for those, alert response type models, and you're creating some very smart automated ways of collecting that data and serving it up quickly so that you can be confident in it. Whereas the data for adaptive management might pull from both of those things, but it's more important that it be regular and comprehensive and really able to give you a picture of not only what's informing your decisions, but what might inform changes to those decisions and help you adapt and become better. So strategies, I probably talked too much on that slide. Some of these strategies for adaptive groundwater management, just some quick examples that would kind of bring it home, bring it into something practical. Obviously, installing groundwater monitoring networks, everybody's doing that. But why? Well, to support an adaptive management strategy you might have, such as using thresholds, groundwater level thresholds to trigger actions, such as, say, pumping curtailments. That's, the big talk. Or maybe you don't have the authority to actually curtail pumping or to enforce behavior changes based on the monitoring you're doing, but you have an adaptive regulatory framework that allows you to drive your public outreach and awareness type actions based on that data. So it's just taking the data that we're collecting all the time and really using it to improve and monitor and observe and then circle around and improve and get better again, so that we're responding to uncertainties. I want to bring that word into play here because that's kind of what these buzzwords are all about, whether it's adaptive strategies or predictive strategies. We're doing these things because of uncertainty in not only how our system behaves. We might have a regional groundwater model that gives us a lot of information, but we don't really know what's going to happen right here in this point in the ground, right? There's uncertainty there. And then uncertainty in the future, whether that's climate driven or population growth, those kinds of factors. And then similarly, just some examples of the kinds of things you'd do under a predictive management strategy driven approach. You'd be looking at these long-term strategies for picking modeling approaches, developing scenarios, gathering data, remote sensing data and GIS, trends analysis, stuff like that. Those are all just examples of predictive management strategies. And then on that immediate response side, of course, there's the, an early warning system is a predictive management strategy. So our decision support tools that are designed to give you kind of a heads up, a lead time on some piece of information. But here's where I'm going with it all. These two terms, while they're not interchangeable, really ought to be combined. I think for the complex nature of this resource that we're trying to manage, and also the uncertainties involved in it, both driven by the people moving in, or the groundwater levels not being sustained, or maybe it's just lack of data. We've got to start combining these things in order to really be effective. And I think, there we go. Where's my words? Combining these things together then is how you kind of get this is my cake and have your cake and eat it too slide. Because you can use forecasts and models to inform decision making. And we've kind of been doing that for a long time, but then you can also set up frameworks that allow you to adjust actions and be proactively responsive to what data is being collected and say, ooh, the model said this, but what we're seeing is actually this, and so let's adjust. I don't know if you were all in here watching Philip's talk of Clearwater's model right before this one, but I think that was a great example of something they're doing, to adapt their management strategies based on, let's improve these models. We have all this data now, let's make them better, and then circle around and adjust, our response and our our management strategies based on these things. So I wanted to give you some actual examples of data-driven tools that we've been helping to create that support, I think, create some, are some good examples of adaptive and predictive management strategies combined. That's what this, I didn't say it on the previous slide. Dynamic adaptive management is the word for that. I didn't make that up. It's up there. But when you combine these two strategies, you're basically dynamic adaptive management in that world. And so this is just kind of a description of how that might work that should seem fairly obvious. You're using models. Maybe you've got a model that relates pumping rates, weather conditions, groundwater levels over time, establishes the relationship between those things. And then you can run these models to create maybe some predictive triggers, some thresholds. If the groundwater levels that we're measuring start falling below this, well, then we're on a trajectory for, this is what the drought mitigation stuff is all about in some parts of Texas, and I'm sure, but definitely all over the parts of Colorado that I work in. When the rainfall hasn't come for X many days, well, okay, we're triggering an action. We're gonna do something about it, whether it's just outreach or it's actual behavior enforcement. But then looking at whether or not that was correct. I wanted to give an example of something that's actually happened this year up on the Front Range in Colorado. Up there, the curtailment of pumping in this system that's largely alluvial is dictated by the state, and it's pretty routine. In the springtime, there's all sorts of water in the streams and in the alluvium, and people are pumping like gangbusters. But then by July and August, those surface flows have run off, and the wells that are so very connected to that surface system have to stop pumping or provide water from another source to offset their pumping. And that's just kind of the way it works from year to year. And that's kind of a predictive management strategy based on knowledge, that we've seen happen over and over. As many of you might have followed, it's been uncharacteristically wet up there this year. And I don't think it stopped raining till middle of July. And that alluvial system along the Front Range in Colorado got recharged naturally. And now it's hot. And now it's hot and dry up there. And we're into that part of the year where the predictive tools would have said, okay, wells, you guys need to either stop pumping or start releasing your reservoir water to offset it, because we're into that time of year. But fortunately, we've got some very adaptive thinking folks who are out there looking at the groundwater levels and looking at the actual monitoring data and saying, you know what, there's still plenty of water in the alluvium. So we've changed their practices this year based on the real data, and probably go and improve some of the predictive modeling too, based on this information of seeing how things change with the kind of that shorter term view of the climate. So anyway, it's just an example of bringing that adaptive piece in and layering it with the predictive piece. This is a picture, a screenshot of a tool that we developed for a city kind of south of Denver. And they pump from an aquifer that's confined, and I would say 500 to 800 feet deep. It's not super deep, but it has really low transmissivity. So they've got these wells all over the place. They're not high producing wells, anywhere from 100 to 300 GPM max. And so their strategy, their operational strategy for managing this system in order to produce enough water for the city is to strategically pump different wells. When the well pumps that low transmissivity, there's these huge cones of depression that get created, and the potential for one well to interfere with another well is really high. So they've got this practice, but it's not been data driven. They've got operators who just kind of know how it works, right? And they know that if they pump that well, then that well over there stops producing very well, so they just kind of do it by the seat of their pants, or they have historically. So we were brought in to help bring together the data that they have been collecting, water level data and pumping data for couple of decades and bring it into a tool that they could start using, because some of those operators that just kind of know the system, they're going to retire, right? And then, like, what's the new guy do? So we're bringing that data together to try to create that similar type of adaptive management potential for somebody who doesn't just hasn't just been working with it for 20 years and know it. So this is a screenshot of we just haven't been working on this project very long yet, but the first picture we brought up was sort of this big eye opener, because we're just lighting up the wells based on whether or not the water level, when they're not pumping, is above or below the top of the aquifer. They call it confinement. And so they're trying to keep as many of those wells pumping under a condition of confinement as possible. So anyway, the telemetry data that gets loaded into this changes how those dots appear. And so depending on what they're pumping when, they can come and look at this map and see kind of how those conditions are changing, and use that to start making decisions about how to operate their wells. And then this is actually the same system. They can click in to one of those and see the time series data. So it kind of, that goes from sort of that more bigger picture view of how's the system look to how does this one well behave. And this was the one I wanted to point at. It's got a really interesting pattern. If you've looked at graphs of water level versus pumping, this is a what's wrong with this picture question for a really specific group of expertise, right? Something's very wrong with this picture. The up and down part on the graph is water levels, and the black kind of spiky things, those are when they're pumping the wells. And you can see that the water levels are starting to decline, and actually have declined quite a bit before they even turn the pump on, over and over and over. And it was this huge eye-opener, because they thought that this well wasn't affected by any other wells. And the other well that they were sort of rotating between, they just thought this well was poor, wasn't very productive. Every time they turned it on, it didn't work, didn't pump very well. And they found out that there was an interaction with another well, significant interaction with another well that their models hadn't predicted. Just kind of, one of those very local aspects of the hydrogeology. So they were able to make some changes in how they rotate around between the wells, and suddenly this well is a great producer now, because they turn it on when the other well isn't on. And it really helps things. And also take this data back to the groundwater models, and now the groundwater modelers, they can actually improve that model and create some better predictions. So they're going to be able to use that to kind of circle around and improve the predictive aspect of things too. Am I not loud enough? I keep backing off because I feel like I'm too loud. Okay, sorry about that. I feel like I'm yelling at you guys. So this is a similar kind of approach, but a much simpler one that is aimed more at that public engagement piece. This is an example. This is actually for North Plains Groundwater Conservation District. I don't think I've seen Odell or Steve here, but they have been collecting winter water levels at a lot of wells since the 70s. They've got an incredible amount of data, and it's just annual. It's just one measurement per year per well, but it creates a very compelling visual when you put it on a graph like this. And there's nothing complicated or hard about this image, right? And we just stuck a linear trend line on there and allowed it to extend out a few years. And this is not a management tool for them to make decisions from. This is more about getting that buy-in, or getting that public education and engagement piece going, because as you all know, and I actually just learned more about yesterday at the drought response panel, not a lot of groundwater districts actually have authority to enforce behavior change. If there's an issue, if the groundwater levels are declining or the drought is here, sometimes the best you can do is kind of ask people to please play nice and buy into our ship rises and sinks together kind of mentality. So tools like this can be really helpful to open that conversation, and not only let folks can come to this tool, it's open, find their own well and click on it, see their own graph, but they can see their neighbor's graph too. And they can really start getting the conversation going about how do we sustain this resource. And this is an example of a really similar thing, but related to water quality. I threw this one in there because it isn't always just about groundwater levels, right? This is an area in Nebraska that is got really shallow groundwater and pretty thin clay layers and highly susceptible to nitrate infiltration. And so it's a similar kind of public conversation engagement tool where you can click anywhere in their district and see what that risk is. They've done a lot of modeling, which is behind this, to calculate this vulnerability, aquifer vulnerability, and then you can then pick from like farming best management practices and see how that might improve or reduce that risk. And so it's a nice tool for the district to communicate with their growers, their members, about how they can, really help by making some fairly straightforward practice changes. Maybe it's cover cropping or splitting their nitrate applications out over the year into 2 or 3 times. But they also can use this. This has been a tool to help go after funding to help then get money to incentivize growers to make those kinds of changes. So just bringing the data into one place and creating some tools like this can really help with those adaptive and strategic management type approaches. We're doing pretty good on time. The early warning systems that I mentioned earlier, I just wanted to throw a quick example in there of that because I think it's a somewhat overlooked possibility, shall we say, or potential of these tools. Once you've got a good predictive model going and you've invested in telemetry, you've got this capability now to make some really highly responsive types of tools. And this is one that the Mile High Flood District that covers the urbanized area in and around and north of Denver, Colorado, is combined some rainfall runoff models with predictive rainfall grids that are being created by the National Weather Service and a couple of local agencies. And they are essentially predicting out between a 4 and 12-hour lead time flow peaks at highly vulnerable intersections, maybe where a bridge might be overtopped or a bike path could get inundated. And then these models will trigger alerts out to emergency response teams. And these teams can not just jump and act based on those alerts, but they can go onto this tool, kind of check out what the model's telling them, understand the context, and combine that with information they have, which oftentimes is even more accurate than anything the model can get, and then really make good decisions about how to respond to something that may be happening in 2 or 6 or 8 hours. So it's been a really effective tool for the Mile High Flood District to not only avoid property damage or even loss of life or injury, but just kind of getting ahead of these things to understand where the vulnerabilities are. And then they'll circle back the adaptive piece. After the events happen, they'll go out, take pictures, take measurements, do surveys, and then circle around and improve these models. So it's pretty cool. Anyway, those are the examples that I have, and I know I flew through that, but if any of you have questions or want to talk more about, I didn't really spend time on the tools themselves because I feel like that's something that is better done in a kind of a live demo situation, but I would love to, why did it go away? There we go. If anyone has questions, I'd be happy to take them now. I'll also be around the rest of the day and most of tomorrow too.
I have one question for you. So when you're working with clients, if they're ignorant about what their needs are, how do you talk them through what you have to offer them, or even how they determine what type of tool they would need to develop, particularly like say for groundwater management strategies?
It's a really good question. I think for me, it starts with asking questions about where they are at in terms of data collection and you can't build some of these kinds of tools I was just showing you until you've got the data and you've got kind of an infrastructure in place. And so the Castle Rock example that I gave at the beginning with the dots, the confinement dots, that was an example of a client that had scads of data and they just weren't doing things with it. So that was a conversation of showing them examples and here's some things we could do, and maybe spinning things up in Excel to get their imagination going. I think it's a for an entity that's done the investment of getting data collected and maybe has telemetry out there and is doing that, then it's kind of like how to spur the imagination. Sometimes it's also how to get past the SCADA operators, because they're sure that what they've got and what they're doing is already covering it. And then the GM is like, no, it's not good enough. So there's sometimes it's that conversation of, how we're not talking about replacing maybe something they've already got, but adding on to it. But then, yeah, sometimes the conversation ends up with, oh, we actually can't build these tools for you yet. We need to focus on helping you get some actual data collection going first. So then that's a kind of a different conversation. Does that help?
So, your work in Castle Rock, how did you initiate that? Since it seems like they thought, like you said, well, our SCADA tells us everything's great, and
Yeah,
we
they actually
know that
came
we
to
need
us.
to turn this well off when we're running this one. So
Yeah.
how did you develop a more analytical way of looking at it and showing reality as it was on the ground, as opposed to what they thought it was in
Yeah.
their mind?
I will tell you, I don't know if you'll like the answer. We also have a groundwater modeling group in our team. And that was what LRE Water was actually hired for, was to set up a groundwater model for them. And this idea of having a dashboard tool to give them immediate feedback from their telemetry wasn't part of the scope. But we were, we were compelled to kind of show them an example of what that might look like anyway, because it just to us seemed like a really good idea. So we just put together a quick demo on our own dime and showed it to them, and they responded really well to it. That was a case where it was trying to get by the SCADA guys, because we were sort of blocked by them and job security kind of thing. So I can say that because this is Texas and there's no one from Colorado here, I think, especially not Castle Rock. But yeah, it was definitely, they didn't ask for it. We had to kind of show it to them first, and then their leadership folks saw it and said, oh, I could use that. I could really do something with that. And that was how we kind of broke through that.
Are there any other questions for Kelly, other than can you turn the mic down? That I'm using, not yours.
I know, right?
And if not, she'll be available afterwards, I'm sure.
I will be here.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.